could you please welcome our first speaker, Karl Friston, who's Professor of Neuroscience at University College London, who will be speaking on minds, markets, and self-evidencing. Karl.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here for many reasons. Scott and I were just discussing in the coffee break how fluent and amazing the conversations were in this morning's session. So I think you better regard us as a light entertainment. Specifically, what I'm going to do is present a Bayesian mechanics that may or may not be useful for agent-based simulations in the context of minds in markets. So that's my agenda. So it's quite a low-level, very pragmatic agenda. And I'm going to take self-evidencing as sort of a normative principle that underwrites the way that you might try and simulate sentient agents, sentient behavior in a multi-agent or an ensemble setting. So I'm going to motivate this from the perspective of normative models of sentient behavior. I'm going to take a first principle account. So this is part of my light entertainment. So I'm going to deny access to all axioms, and I'm going to ask, from the perspective of a physicist, what kinds of behaviors will any self-organizing system have to possess and should be evinced in the way that we observe it behaving. And I'm going to basically promote a principle of least action as a way to ground simulations, and then give you a few examples of what we call active inference in terms of the ensuing belief propagation, with a special emphasis on epistemic foraging. So I was very pleased to hear about epistemic markets. That's really going to be quite center stage in terms of the story that could be developed using this kind of Bayesian mechanics, with a special emphasis on shared narratives, and by that I'm sort of reading that as our version of this distributed cognition and belief updating. There are so many things I'd like to talk about. We've only got 20 minutes, so I'm just going to race through seeing what is offered from the perspective of physics, and then we can pick up on what themes were interesting in the discussion. So everything I'm going to say is predicated on the notion that all that we do, all that we think, all the choices that we make are in the service of maximizing the evidence for our models of the world, given some outcomes, observations O, conditional upon a generative model, a world model of how we think our universe works. And that not only includes belief updating and sense making, but also planning and the choices that ensue from that planning. So I'm talking about planning as inference. So I'm casting everything as an inference sense-making problem, technically in terms of belief structures, Q of latent states of the universe, of the world, of the market, and Q beliefs about my controls, my choices, my decisions, and all of them are just trying to maximize the probability of outcomes given my model of the world. And I'm licensing that normative perspective from the perspective of a number of established normative accounts of behavior. So, for example, if we read that sort of log probability of observations as preferred outcomes, outcomes that are characteristic of me as a system, they are valuable outcomes, and therefore I can construe action and perception, or perceptual and planning as perceptual inference and planning as inference, as trying to maximize value. And we can read off reinforcement learning and behavioral psychology, optimal control theory in engineering, and possibly expected utility theory in classical economics. If I was an information theorist, the negative of that kind of value is known as self-information in information theory, sometimes known as surprisal, or more simply surprise, which means that everything I do is in the service of minimizing surprises. So leveraging those catastrophic events, those prediction errors that we heard about, those when things go wrong, that's when I do my belief updating and make the important choices. From the point of view of information theory, that conforms to the principle of maximum mutual information, or the Informax principle, also articulated as a minimum redundancy principle, and also as the free energy principle, where the free energy provides a bound upon or approximation to this surprise. The average of surprise is entropy, which means that if I'm trying to minimize my surprise, on average, it would look as though I'm trying to minimize the dispersion of the outcomes that I encounter, and implicitly the states engendering those outcomes. And of course, that's a holy grail of self-organization in physics, synergetics. And if as a physiologist, it's this homeostasis. It's this keeping my states and the measurable or observable outcomes within viable bounds. I'm going to take a final perspective on this quantity, which is the perspective that Nick Chater would, I think, appreciate, and the perspective afforded by statistics. So this quantity, the probability of outcomes given a model, is known as model evidence. And from this, we can read out things like the Bayesian brain, evidence accumulation, and predictive coding as an instance of evidence accumulation under this overriding imperative to maximize model evidence. So what is this free energy? You can regard it really, if you're a physicist, as an instance of James's maximum entropy principle under constraints. So what are the constraints? Well, they're supplied by a generative model, usually articulated in terms of a likelihood and a prior. So put simply, if I write down the outcomes that I expect probabilistically, given the state of the world generating those observations, and I supplement that with some prior beliefs about states of the world that I typically occupy, then I have a generative model. And they supply the constraints. I'm going to try to maximize my entropy, avoid committing to particular beliefs about what's going on out there, whilst at the same time trying to provide an accurate account by maximizing the likelihood under prior constraints. So technically, this objective function, this variation-free energy function, is used in most of high-end machine learning and things like variation autoencoders. It's known as an evidence lower bound, the acronym ELBO. A ubiquitous and really important objective function in most of deep learning, or certain what deep learning would aspire to. And I've just written this down mathematically just to show that basically this is the free energy is the log of the evidence I'm trying to maximize minus something that can be never less than zero. So if I can sort of maximize this, I'm almost guaranteed to maximize my log evidence. Why is this important? Well, having a generative model under the hood means that if I do this properly with reference to a generative model, I always have an explainable AI, and that may well become important if you wanted to use this technology to simulate markets in a way that can be explained to people. It's probably not as beautiful as an invisible hand, but it certainly has an explainability and a formal explainability for free. You get all sorts of things with C, design optimality, optimal epistemic foraging and the like. Just rearranging those terms gives you another perspective on this quantity, that the evidence just is accuracy minus complexity. So in self-evidencing, what I'm trying to do is to provide an accurate account of the causes of my measurable observations, my outcomes, that crucially is minimally complex as possible. It is as simple as possible. And we'll all be familiar with that in terms of Occam's principle. A few perspectives on Occam's principle. Functional specialization is particularly relevant. In the last talk, we were treated to the notion of functional specialization and segregation in markets and in the brain, and in a sense that sort of carving up of the world into simple components that are coupled to each other is an instance of this sort of complexity minimization. Complexity also reads as literally the computational cost, and via things like Landauer's principle and the Jasinski equality, it means that you're going to, in minimizing complexity, do the job of self-evidencing as efficiently as possible. And I mean that both in terms of statistical efficiency, but also thermodynamic efficiency. So if the markets are working well, they're using less electricity, they're using less transactions to minimize that complexity. The story I'm going to tell is not so much about optimal behavior in this normative account, but can we understand the implications of this first principles approach for the choices that we make, with the important observation that in making choices, we haven't at hand the outcomes that are consequent upon those choices. So we have to move into a world of the objective function expected, conditioned upon my choices. And what we're going to basically see is that the accuracy, when thought about or articulated in the future, in terms of some counterfactual choice or way forward or policy, becomes exactly the same objective function that underwrites optimal Bayesian design, getting the right data to resolve my uncertainty about how my observations are caused. The complexity reduces to something which is very akin to risk that underwrites optimal decisions in a Bayesian decision theoretic context. So these are two, if you like, sides of the same coin that, when put together, very much like accuracy and complexity, give you an expected free energy or an expected self-evidence that combines these two aspects of Bayes optimality in decision making. So just to illustrate where that sits in relation to sort of more axiomatic or utilitarian approaches, what I would normally do if I was lecturing to psychologists, I would ask you to imagine you're an owl and you're hungry. So what are you going to do? Scott, what are you going to do? You're really hungry. And you're flying around. Well,
What am I going to do?
yes.
I'm not feeling hungry at the moment.
Oh, is there anybody here feeling hungry? You've all had your biscuits, so this is not going to work, is it? Anyway, what Scott normally says is he's going to look for his food, and that's the answer that I would. That's no problem. So, in that simple answer, searching for food, there is, I think, a lot of power in terms of disambiguating or choosing between the kind of calculus you'd want to use to simulate or understand good behaviour. And I'm deliberately creating a dialectic here, which I'll repair later on, using this answer, well, I'm going to search for my food. There are two ways that you might sort of write down good behaviour. The first rests upon the notion that if I had a value function of the states of the world that would ensue, given some choice u sub t, then I could define a state action policy would always maximize the value of the state subsequent upon an action. And that kind of approach underwrites most of reinforcement learning optimal control theory. But if it's the case that what I actually do is searching for my food, we know that this kind of calculus won't work. And that's simply because searching is an action that resolves uncertainty. And uncertainty is an attribute of a belief. If I read a belief in a Bayesian sense as a conditional probability distribution, then what we need is an objective function that is a functional of a belief. So it's a function of beliefs about states of the world, not states of the world themselves, which are unknowable. And that leads to a very different kind of calculus, a different kind of mechanics for belief updating and choice behavior. Also, searching for food tells you something else. You know, it matters whether I search for my food and then try to eat it, or eat it and then search for it. So the order matters. And that brings to the table now the notion that you've got a path integral of a free energy, or sorry, an energy functional, which we'll see is expected free energy, which means that we're now in the game of sequential policy optimization, sequences of behaviors where each behavior updates my beliefs and dictates where to go from there, but simply because the best thing to do has to be a function of my beliefs and my uncertainty about the world. So if we wanted to compare and contrast these two things, on the left-hand side, we have things which would be subsumed under Bellman's optimality principle, things like optimal control theory, dynamic programming, deep reinforcement learning, expected utility, and so on. In contrast, there's a simpler and more fundamental principle at hand, which is Hamilton's principle of stationary action. And this is what the free energy principle is about, underwrites artificial curiosity, intrinsic motivation in robotics, sequential policy optimization and the like. So that's the basic story. So what is that expected free energy. Forgive the equations, I'm just racing through these iconically, but there's something quite beautiful about writing down these equations in full, just because of the symmetry. When we move from the objective function in the moment to what this objective function would look like when we think about using it to define our choices. So what I've done here is just written it out in terms of the complexity and the accuracy, rearranged the terms, is sort of moving one of the terms around to re-express it as a KL divergence and the log evidence that people in machine learning would be familiar with. And then I've just taken exactly the same functional form and now taken the expectation or the average under my beliefs about what would happen if I did that. And what we see is that essentially complexity becomes risk, inaccuracy becomes ambiguity, that divergence, that relative entropy or information gain becomes an expected information gain, and the log evidence or the negative log evidence becomes an expected cost function. And you'll all be familiar with these in one or another guise. So for example, if I ignore the expected cost, that expected information gain is just the relative entropy or the information gain of about hidden states or latent states of the world with observations following a policy compared to my beliefs without those observations. So it's the amount of uncertainty that I've resolved or the information that I have gained by committing to that way of doing things or that particular policy. It's known as Bayesian surprise in the visual search literature and neurosciences. More generally, it's just the mutual information between causes and consequences. If I remove a particular kind of uncertainty from the table here and pretend I live in a world where there's no ambiguity, I can just see everything out there. I can see all the hidden states, say, of the market. So my outcomes, my observations just become states of the world. So there's no ambiguity left at all. I'm just left with this risk thing, which is another KL divergence, and it's just the difference between my beliefs about the states of the world if I pursued this policy relative to my preferred states, my prior preferences. And that can be read as the objective function that is found in KL control or risk-sensitive control, again with a bit of poetic license in economics. And finally, if I remove all uncertainty, or at least all reducible uncertainty from the table, oh, right, good, then I'm just left, I've now got back to Bellman's optimality principle and expected utility theory. So that's the basic story. Expected value plus expected information gain equals expected free energy, which means that making Bayes optimal decisions under the constraints of Bayes optimal design and epistemic foraging means active inference, or we call it active inference. So I'll just, in the last couple of minutes, just whip through some applications of this. And they all rest on sort of off-the-shelf technology. So if you can write down your generative model as something called a graphical model, a probabilistic graphical model, there always exists something called a factor graph. You don't need to know this. If you know this, it's boring. If you don't know this, all you need to know is that you can just go to websites and download this software, simply because you can always associate a factor graph which tells you about the message passing required to do this kind of belief updating if you can write down your generative model as a graphical model. And knowing the functional form and the nature of the messages that are passed around, the transactions, tells you a lot about the computational architectures, the computing, which we've leveraged in the neurosciences to understand things in terms of belief updating, learning, choice making. We can then apply this kind of technology with this particular focus on this epistemic imperative to resolve uncertainty, this sort of optimal Bayesian design kind of notion, given that we are all faced with this problem all the time, in terms of deciding what to invest in if you're in finance, through to simply where to look next. I have an enormous array of options in terms of where to deploy my center of gaze in the next 200 milliseconds, and I have to do it in a way that resolves the most uncertainty. And we can simulate artificial agents who are doing this kind of epistemic foraging, doing this sort of visual search, trying to resolve uncertainty about the scene at hand, given a particular hypothesis. So the notion here is that sort of the way that we move and query, interrogate the world is literally an experiment, and therefore is subject to the principles of optimal Bayesian experimental design. You can write this down, you can simulate it, and produce remarkably lifelike behavior. Taking that mechanics into the context, which I think you'll be much more interested in, of distributed cognition and belief sharing and mutual inference. First of all, stepping from sort of me making sense of my universe to me making sense of you and looking at dyadic interactions, brings us to sort of notions of knowing my place, having a shared generative model, which means that we can both have a shared commitment to the way the world works, and to minimize our surprise, to resolve our uncertainty. I just have to find my place in our shared world, and then we provide each other with the right signals, and everything becomes mutually predictable. And we can simulate that using simulations of little cells, or indeed communication. We can look at the emergence of language as simply a response to this imperative to resolve uncertainty. This little example here just shows one lady querying and asking questions of another lady who can see a scene, but the first lady can't. But she can choose those policies that resolve her uncertainty by asking the right questions. And we can show that language and communication is an emergent property of this imperative. This is just meant to illustrate that you can then extend this kind of simulation to multi-agent games and start to think about the spread of ideas and memes and deontic cues and the like, in terms of two examples here, one from Amsterdam and one from Canada, in terms of spreading ideas. The graphics here just represent the sort of what would happen to ideas that are communicated via tweets, where you've got this sort of dual imperative to share a generative model, to identify people like me, that implicitly now start to acquire an epistemic trust, versus the novelty seeking that comes from the requirement to minimize uncertainty. So what tends to happen is you get segregation into sort of blues and reds, basically, illustrated here. And I was going to close just by showing how this kind of technology has been applied not to markets but epidemiological modeling, but putting behavior into the mix and beliefs into the mix, and making the particular and final point that in simulating these things there is a choice between three kinds of models. So these are basically agent-based models that have been embedded within an epidemiological conventional EIR model, in a way that allows the behavior to talk to the prevalence of infection, for example, and exploit the circular causality. If I think the prevalence is very high, I'm unlikely to leave home and commit to lockdown. And that's going to have a material effect on the risk that I'm going to get infected, and that will have knock-on effects in terms of prevalence. Write this sort of circular causality in the context of these complex systems. But the point I just wanted to bring to the table, which is not, or the question which is not answered, is how far do you go in terms of putting markets into these complex systems, minds into these complex systems that could be markets. You could go the whole hog and actually do the belief updating using those factor graphs that I talked about before. There is an intermediate step, though, which I would suspect is probably the sort of the more viable in the short term, which is just to put belief states into your complex systems model, to actually have the beliefs of communities or individuals or ensembles as phenomena or states that are coupled and mediate, in this example, the influence of an epidemiological state of the population in terms of its behavioral responses. But these responses are now not directly and phenologically linked with some sort of causal link. They're now mediated by beliefs that you can, in an empirical way, start to estimate as hidden states of your population using self-reports or psychological instruments in my world as a halfway house between actually putting minds into a simulated market. So I'll close with everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler, with a nod to simplicity and the minimization of complexity, and just thank those people whose ideas I've been talking about. Thank you very much indeed.
I get to move on directly to our next speaker, Scott Kelso, who's Professor of Complex Systems and Brain Sciences at Florida Atlantic University, and he'll be speaking on coordination, dynamics, and the metastable mind.
My father was Scottish. He was from Ayrshire, and we heard a lot more about the poet Robbie Burns than Adam Smith. And in fact, one of his favourites was To a Louse, and I'll say, "Oh, would some power the gift to gie us, to see ourselves as others see us," right? So this was always a statement that we were conscious of as children. They say that the Scottish Enlightenment began with Adam Smith and David Hume, and it ended with the death of Robert Burns. And I think there's a question here. Is there a new Enlightenment here with Patrick's theory? And what can we do about it? So I'm going to talk about 3 points. Oh, right, it's here. Oh, good. And actually, I was thinking I might rename my talk from becoming to being. Okay. The mind that I'm going to introduce to you is not anything like you've heard today, but I think it has a strong basis, both mathematically, theoretically, empirically, importantly. So let's go to that quickly. Which do I say to go forward? Right. So what kind of brain mind are we talking about? The mind that we've created boundaries with, where we try to map mental operations onto physiological structures. I think there are some serious problems with that, by the way, but we don't have time really to go on to that. Let's see. I'm trying to get, which button do I hit to move this forward? Right. So the second thing is the market mind principle. Intelligent self-organization via market dynamics underlies both minds and markets. This is from Patrick's paper. Market dynamics, not anything about computation so far, are the processes that are universal and shared between minds and markets. And what is intelligent self-organization? That's a fundamental question. If I went around here and asked you, what is intelligent self-organization, I bet I would come up with a whole bunch of different answers. The elephant in the room is the economy is about the physicality of production, the market's about the psychology of their exchange. These are quotes. Let me go quickly here. The elephant in economics room is the mind-body problem. Right? So let me talk about the mind-body problem. I won't. In simple terms, the mind-body problem asks to explain the relationship between matter, the brain, and mind. Okay, how about that, guys? As a problem, we heard today that the levels problem and the measurement problem are future problems. How about this one? How about taking it on? Is it the brain-mind like this? This is like, I will very quickly, and not with any disrespect at all, simply say that this is the way that cognitive neuroscience tends to think about things. This is Posner's orienting and executive network. You know, it's sort of like your ankle bone's connected to your knee bone's connected to your hip bone, and it's that kind of information processing view. This is from my student, Mengchen Zhang, and her work at Stanford. Is it more like this, where you've actually got patterns of neural activity that are actually attractors? These balls represent that. And where brain structure, as well as inputs and noise and so on, can move these patterns around a brain, a bifurcating brain, a dynamic brain. What is self-organization? This is a paper from Robert Laughlin, the most profound revolution in the study of matter in the last 30 years or so. Lachlan, Nobel laureate, discovered this himself, I guess. What is, when we talk about emerging markets, what is emergence about? What is self-organization in nature? What is it actually is, as we know it? And it's that in complex open systems, they're probably homeokinetic systems, not homeostatic systems at all, by the way. The patterns arise spontaneously in a self-organized fashion. There's no ghost in the machine, etc. The emerging patterns are characterized by order parameters. This is the language of brains and markets. What are the order parameters here that are synergizing these kinds of systems? A kind of information compression, if you like. There are control parameters which don't control anything. They simply move the system through these different patterns of organization. They don't prescribe them at all. And at these critical points, loss of stability, where stability is a key concept, and stability is a function of state. And actually, the mind that I'm going to suggest to you is that we've got to get rid of states. Okay? Get rid of them altogether. It's very important to know states, but then it's important to break symmetries and see that states give rise to tendencies. Tendencies are far more fluid and adaptive. But certainly one can see all these effects. And then the coordination dynamics has complex solutions. So the dynamics may be low dimensional, but it gives you then a broad range of possibilities. This is a kind of a formulaic approach. Turn to physics. Ken Wilson, Nobel laureate. What did he find? He found universality. He found the universality of phase transitions as a mechanism of self-organization. What's the universality mean? It means that systems with very many different material properties, fluids, magnets, whatever, behave exactly the same near criticality. Exactly the same. And that was the block spin method, the renormalization group method of Wilson and Fisher, actually. Fisher didn't get the Nobel Prize. The emergence of consciousness, Patrick's question. Global ignition theory of consciousness resembles, I italicize that, what physicists call a phase transition, or mathematicians call bifurcation. Everybody knows what that is. Dehaene and Schurger, Schrödinger's My View of the World. That's becoming as conscious. Being is unconscious. Huh? Think about that one. Our self-organizing phase transition is the missing link between matter, movement, and mind. Okay, this is data. Now, we're doing experiments with what's called magnetoencephalography. I won't go into it. These are squids. They pick up very minute electromagnetic currents that are generated by dendritic currents actually in the brain. Just to show you that in real experiments, you actually see these phase transitions in the human brain. So if you're changing a control parameter, a system will switch its behavior dynamically, and you can actually observe these in the human brain. The nose is up at the top, the back of the head is at the bottom, and these are patterns that you see. And you see this sort of abrupt jump, and these can be experimentally shown time and time again. Even earlier work where if you look at the signals themselves in their Fourier spectra, you can compute the phase relations between the signals. Actually, this is a very simple experiment where people have to consciously put a movement in between beats, and the beat rate increases. And then you suddenly find that people can't syncopate anymore. They turn to synchronization. And that's this transition that you see. And you can see that every time the control parameter changes, namely the beat rate goes up, 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 you see the person is unable to keep the syncopated rate. And in fact, you see this kind of, I speak quite loud. You see quite clearly there the fluctuations that grow before the transition. In physics, this is called, also called critical slowing down. These are predicted features of self-organization. Okay? They're anticipating tipping points. Someone was talking this morning about 1/f noise and so on. These are critical fluctuations, critical slowing down, predicted features of phase transitions. So there isn't any resembling going on here. This is it. This is a non-equilibrium phase transition. Yeah, published in physics journals and other places. So why is this discovery of phase transitions important? Expression of self-organization in the brain. Okay. Switching decision-making occurs under certain conditions without switches, so there's no, you don't put the ghost in the machine, and clearly provides a mechanism underlying global ignition of conscious states. Now, I want to, could I have a little water? Or maybe this is mine. Mm-hmm. Thank you. I want to take another example here, which, again, people would associate it with a consciousness, the notion of agency, where agency is defined in the Oxford English Dictionary as a source of action towards an end. And I'm going to tell you about babies, how babies develop agency. You've heard about computational agents a lot, but I want to tell you how human agents develop agency, okay? And I'm going to do that with an experiment. There's a theory that's already been published and so on. This is Piaget, and Piaget already noticed with his 3-month-old son that when he tied a rattle from the infant's hand to the rattle that was on the crib, that the infant suddenly realized it would make the rattle move. Get it? Make something happen. So agency means that you're making something happen in the world. Where does that come from? Where does directed, intelligent self-organization come from, right? Ask yourself that question. Well, Piaget had anecdotal evidence. Conscious coordination seems definite. Therefore, it seems that the swinging was intentional. Yeah? Where does that come from? Okay, here's a real experiment done in our laboratory, and it's Elisa Sloan's PhD thesis. I won't go into all the details, except, thank you very much, except to give you the gist of this, there's basically these infants come in and you put them in a crib and they spontaneously kick. You know, they move around. And then, if you put a mobile up above their head, they like that. They like the mobile, but soon they get frustrated, yeah? And they stop doing things. But then, if you tie a tether from the baby's foot and connect it to the mobile, actually the baby suddenly realizes that my kicking is causing the mobile to move. Okay? So agency here emerges out of a coupling between the organism and the environment. It's not in the organism itself, it's between the organism and the environment. And you have to, scientifically, you have to actually treat that complete phenomenon as an entity itself, yeah, as a relation. It's a whole relational thing. So here in the tethered phase, the baby kicks and realizes, I'll show you a little bit of the data, and then you can uncouple the baby and see what happens. Okay, during the non-contingent mobile movement, that's to say when the experimenter is moving the mobile, you see here the trigger foot, the foot that's tethered, or the tether is going to be put on, and the unconnected foot, you can see these are quite related to each other, but not at all related to the mobile movement. What you're actually looking at is the displacement over time of the experiment. But now if you look over here during the tethered phase, you see the trigger foot and the mobile are very, very tightly coupled, yeah, relative to, say, the trigger foot and the unconnected foot. So the trigger foot and the unconnected foot are what we would call embodied, rather. The trigger movement and the environment would be embedded, yeah? So this is what we have here. And you can see how tightly that is. Now, if you look at this time series carefully, and what we did actually was compute the acceleration, the rate of change of the velocity. And I won't go into this in detail, but that's this thing here. You can see that there's a point where there's a maximum rate of change, and that maximum, here's the displacement of the baby's foot, and you can see at a certain point the amplitude of the displacement increases dramatically. It's very, very interesting that if you compute the slope over time that you see before the transition, the slope is 0.08, but after the transition it doubles. Okay? So there's a critical point here in the displacement over time, and this critical point indicates the baby realizing that it's an agent. The baby has become an agent. So if you've ever asked yourselves, how do we become an agent? This is it. This is the way it goes. Okay? This is the laser here on the left. And you all probably know this, but at a critical value of the applied electromagnetic field, there's the photons suddenly turn into, it was called Einstein's stimulated emission effect. The photons start to gather, and they are coordinated. They are coherent. And this is the onset of lasing. Over here is the baby, where there's this kind of spontaneous exploration going on, and then it shifts to goal directedness. So the bottom line is there's a transition from spontaneous to goal-directed, and this is intelligent self-organization, and that these phase transitions transcend physical, biological, and cognitive systems. So if you're asking what the source of conscious agency is, the answer is it's a phase transition. Okay? And then one, of course, can explore lots of other questions regarding that, but this is the fundamental answer. Okay, I mentioned already, and people were actually talking about levels and so on. A key concept of coordination dynamics is this order parameter. It's a low-dimensional description. You can see that here the individual coordinating elements under parametric change give rise to this collective coordination pattern. And once that pattern starts to form, that affects the elements that are interacting to produce it. 5 minutes, very good. Thank you. So it's a meaningful and relational quantity. It unfolds different kinds of things, different levels. It's really a perfect way to think about how things come together. And this is a sort of almost classical model. I introduce it here very quickly to give you the elements of the nonlinear dynamics. Here, there are two factors dictating the entire dynamics. One is the heterogeneity of the parts, how different the parts are, and the other is the coupling strength between the parts. Okay? And this is, if I go back one, you can see here that this system has multiple states, and then at a critical point, the system switches. You can break the symmetry and see other things which are extremely interesting, but it's very analogous, if you like, to this particular picture where the optimism of the investor changes to euphoria, where there can be maximum risks. He can keep behaving the same way, and then that can from feeling great about his investment or her investment, this can change dramatically. It can turn into fear, etc. And you can see this kind of, these words describe the market mood, the mood of the investor. Just to let you know, there are real studies where you can apply a voltage to a particular region of the brain called the nucleus accumbens, and you can take the patient here, these were 5 patients, from being completely despondent to totally relaxed and easy, feels great. By one single change in the control parameter, namely the voltage applied, you can move this feeling from, oh, I'm anxious and I'm definitely not relaxed, to feeling high and so on. And then there are ethical questions about when you implant these electrodes, what you're going to do and so on. The last part I really wanted to emphasize here is looking at that model I showed you before. It's called the Haken. Karl mentioned Hermann Haken. He's a great man, wrote the theory of the laser, 95 years old. But this is the HKB model, except with this individual diversity parameter put in. And in fact, the dynamics here, this is the dynamics down here, where you're looking at the order parameter, its derivative against itself, and you can see the layout of the fixed points. See, there's stable fixed points. The black dots are the stable fixed points. The open dots are the unstable or repelling fixed points. And you can see that the states here exhibit multi-stability. So that's a feature you're going to see, I think, a lot. You'll see transitions as a function of changes in control parameter. And then my last key point here is that when you get into this range over here, where there's the right balance between what the individual elements are doing relative to how they're coupled, you will see what I call metastability, beyond stability, namely there are no states at all. Okay? They're just tendencies. You see? So there's a tendency to be integrated and a tendency to be segregated. Tendency to be integrated, tendency to be segregated. Yeah? So these coexisting tendencies I mark with a squiggle. These are integration, segregation. The neuroscience would refer to these coordinated states as integrated, and where there are no coordinated states as segregated. And now we have this place here called metastability. And that's the revolution, to become a metastabilian. To be in this place, actually, where you're not going to be fully integrated on the top here. You're not going to be stuck. You're going to be in this segregation integration place where you escape, then you dwell, you escape, and so on. It's just to illustrate that. This dynamics gives rise to a whole bunch of complementary pairs. So choice and chance are both part of this dynamics. The individual and the collective are both parts of the dynamics. So if you only focus on the collective without attending to the individual, you'll get it wrong. You have to see both aspects as complementary. The exact same thing, the individual components, if they're too different, will compete with each other relative to how strongly they're coupled. And that's a cooperation competition situation. So again, these are all features of metastability. And in fact, ignore the top, your brain here and behavior is living in a sea of metastability. So when you talk about states, you're talking about stability. That's on the bottom line. You maybe can't see it, it's in yellow. And that means you're in there, regardless of, even if you have multiple states, you're in states that have stability. If you're uncoupled, you're just all over the place. There's no integration at all. But look at the space in between. That's where you dwell, escape, dwell, escape. It's like William James's stream of consciousness. right? His stream, his flow of dynamics, right? So this is the brain. It's a dynamical structure that's flowing all the time. And it has, its intrinsic property is metastability. And metastability is going to give you a slightly different view on things. It's going to say individual, collective. Those are coexisting complementary pairs. Cooperation, competition. There isn't one without the other. They're always there. Integration, segregation. It's the same deal, right? You have both tendencies coexisting at the same time. Bohr called this complementarity, except this is slightly different. This is actually the two tendencies, the two opposing tendencies coexist at exactly the same time. So whenever you think, this is competition, where competition looks to be the game here, cooperation is sitting right there. It's sitting right there. If you say, I'm going to do my own thing, actually, you can't do your own thing without the collective still being there, right? So that's the key. This is the metastabilion, where the brain lives, in a sea of metastability. No stable states at all, just dwells and escapes, just as William James had it. The perching and flights of a bird, the stream of consciousness. I have to close. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Aaron is assistant professor in psychology and at the Brain Institute at Chapman University. And I will now turn it over to him.
Thanks. Thank you. So I'm a couple of points off. I'm afraid to ask my first question because there's just so many brilliant things that we could discuss right now, and I'm reluctant because I know we might just go off into some amazing land of discussion, and I'll never get to the second question, and the third, and the fourth. But well, so be it. If we do that, that would be great. And I'm getting used to this is now my notebook. This thing, and so it just doesn't hold a candle to paper. I'm realizing. So, but okay. I think, first a quick question, which maybe we will get past for Scott. Now, this is a fascinating experiment with the baby. I love that, and so I like this idea of agency emerging from what I perceive to be random behavior in the face of Hebbian learning. You combine random behavior with Hebbian learning, and agency emerges. That's how I understood. For one quick point, it's hard to see how markets might exhibit agency, and that's something that we might want to take up.
Agency all the time. They're talking about computational agents. That's what
Well,
heard that all morning.
The individual elements of markets do, but the question about your baby experiment is, what about adding a variable delay in the tether?
Yes.
Have you done that?
No.
And what do you suspect?
I expect that small delays, the system may be stable under sufficiently stable under small delays. Larger delays could induce, again, more random chaotic-like behavior. It's a very, very good experiment. I have to tell you that there were 16 babies, and sensors were put on 18 parts of the body. And the mobile was measured. By the way, in psychology, this is called mobile conjugate reinforcement. Very Skinnerian, right? And it's really the basis, as it were, of reinforcement learning from psychology. Yeah. But actually, this looks entirely different it's a pity you didn't see the movie because it tells a story. Because the baby is looking, and you can see the baby's face and its gaze and so on with the mobile. And we're actually measuring the mobile as well. It's an amazing situation that in the history of psychology, and these papers were published in Science, places like that the stimulus, the mobile, was never measured, nor was the coordination with the mobile, right? Which is quantified here. So it's in the coordination that you actually see this emergence happen. this relation. I mean, that relational view is coming in strongly. Actually, I think the Vice Provost mentioned quantum entanglement. Things are connected here, you know, and they're remotely connected. So you hit it here, you get a response over there. Circuits don't do that kind of thing. Synergies do it, but circuits don't very well. So it's a relational idea, and that relation is fundamentally the baby and the mobile, namely the organism and the environment.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks. Okay, so I'm going to just make a few kind of remarks, my reflections on these two excellent talks, and then just get to an initial question, at least, that I think, and I didn't anticipate it working out this way, but that really cuts across both these perspectives. So, like minds, I suspect that markets undergo behavioral state changes or state transitions. In an animal, for example, this can be a transition from rest to foraging. And these state changes can be, or at least appear to be, or can appear to be spontaneous. Predicting such state changes in continuous time is a particularly challenging problem in neuroscience. And my intuition is that the same is true in the study of markets. And it's something that, however, we would very much like to be able to do better than we do now, for reasons that I think Patrick can talk more about. As an interesting aside, in talking about, Scott, attractors vis-a-vis consciousness, consciousness, it turns out, if we think of these state transitions as moving from one attractor to another, potentially, right? Consciousness, it turns out, is characterized by a disregard in patterns of activity for the attractors suggested by the anatomy. That is to say, put another way, non-conscious activity is characterized by a relative obedience to the attractors that are defined by the anatomy. That's the work of Bartfeld, recent work of Bartfeld. And it's just an aside, which I thought you might want to comment on. So if in economics and markets, the causes of data about economic events are mental in nature, as stated above, then in that case, the game becomes one of trying to optimize beliefs about mental causes. This suggests a new approach to predicting markets, not by modeling the market itself, which seems to at least get us nowhere, because prior market data are not good predictors of future market states, but by modeling the causal determinants of markets, that is, minds informed by market data. Thinking of the anticipation and prediction of discrete events in systems, like markets or minds, what kind of approach, Karl, does the free energy principle applied to markets suggest for the prediction of discrete events and state transitions in markets? And likewise for Scott under the rubric of dynamical systems.
You want to go first?
No.
Well, I think, you see, why I showed you this example in the squid data, in the brain, dynamics, is that you can actually see anticipatory signatures of change. So if you had the market under the same constraints, if you knew the timescales, right? Timescales are crucial in these non-equilibrium phenomena, these open systems, okay? So as parameters, whatever those parameters are changing, you'll only see these transitions if you give the system long enough to relax after a perturbation. So your control parameter is perturbing the system, and then the system's relaxing back. And as it approaches change, it's relaxing back slower and slower. That's called critical slowing down. And those are anticipatory signatures of non-equilibrium phase transitions. Schurger and others have shown this paper in Nature a few years ago in climate, for example, and brought to bear actually exactly these concepts. When people in market, for example, the earlier speakers talking about 1 over F alpha noise, of course, fluctuations are crucial. And I don't know, maybe there's some mathematicians here that know, or theoretical physicists, but my sense of this is that the analytical work with 1 over F alpha noise is just not there. It's just not there. That's because it's probably not possible or something, you know. So it's a really interesting thing. So there's a very nice paper by Haken and Yuval Portugali, and it comments and it integrates Karl's picture with the synergetics picture. And there, actually, you can see that ordinary Markov processes and that whole set of tools is used in these non-equilibrium phase transitions, but not the actual facts of 1 over F alpha noise that seem to describe the way financial markets behave.
Okay, thanks. And so, Karl, what about you? What does the free energy principle suggest as ways to predict future behavior in brains or markets?
Right, so 2 ways of answering that. First of all, linking it to what Scott has just spoken about. So from my perspective, that those attractor landscapes are defined by a free energy functional of states of being or observations. And interestingly, that sort of Occam's principle aspect, that minimum complexity, that sort of carving nature at its joints in the right kind of way, that translates mathematically into an energy landscape that has a very low curvature, which is, I think, permissive of these critical slowing, this instability, this metastability, this itinerancy. So, you know, if you now take the variation free energy as defining the kinds of landscapes that support these kinds of dynamics, you will inevitably predict that they will be itinerant. They will also show critical slowing simply because of this imperative to comply with James's maximum entropy principle or Occam's principle. So that would be one, I think, way of connecting the dynamics to the epistemics, essentially, because if you read the free energy as a function of belief states, then I think there's a really beautiful and a deep connection there. Practically speaking, I think you'd have to ask what you mean by consciousness. So, the notion of mind in market. From the point of view of the free energy principle, there are different kinds of minds. There are very simple minds that do self-correction and have a homeostasis. And then there are more complicated kinds of minds, effectively generative models, that are able to model the consequences of their own action should they acquire agency. And these become deep generative models, and very simply, they move you from a thermostat to something that can plan. So I think the question you have to ask is, do markets plan? So are they mindful in the sense that they're restorative and they have some preferred states, even though they're itinerant in the way that they maintain those states, so they never actually get to those states? But are markets mindful in the sense that I have a homeostasis and I'm self-correcting, like the weather or evolution? Or do you really mean that they can plan and they would show that intrinsic curiosity, they would actually be capable of deceit, they'd actually ask questions? Because that to my mind is a big question, and it's the kind of question I would ask of evolution. Does evolution plan? If you don't think that markets can plan and show curiosity, but the curiosity comes from the individuals that contribute to the emergent dynamics that is manifest at the market scale, then you're going to have to model it with agent-based simulations where the agents show curious behavior. If you think
Right.
that the markets are curious objects in and of themselves and are that kind of mindful, then I think you can get away with sort of mean field modelling and epidemiological modelling and sort of meteorological modelling, ice flow modelling, that kind of maths
Right.
that would hopefully show exactly the dynamics that you've been talking about. But I think it's a big question you have to ask.
So what counts as, or what would effectively be predictive depends on which stance you take.
Yeah, so I'm assuming, I mean, the whole purpose of the sort of the simulations I've been talking about and using free energy, gradient flows on free energy to simulate the dynamics of self-organization is to do situational awareness or to do forecasting. So, for example, in epidemiology, what's the R reproduction number today with no lag, or what's going to happen in 3 weeks' time if we do this or we do that. But to get those predictions right, you have to have the right generative model under the hood. So I come back to a question to you, really, or to the audience. You know, do you think that the market can actually show curious behavior? Is it a curious system?
Could I just say one thing about curiosity, just very, very quickly? That the whole idea of reinforcement learning and reward breaks down in the face of these baby data, because the question is what is the basis of the reward, and that's where we, I think, are looking at curiosity as the key factor, and exploratory activity as the key factor in that. So I would want to add that to this picture. Second picture I would add is that I don't think homeostasis is the game here. Already in the late 70s, Iberol in Science, Science of Complex Systems, not well-known paper, argued very strongly that cycles are the essence, limit cycles. And the limit cycle is there because these are open thermodynamic systems. They're not closed. They're not equilibrium systems at all. They are systems that are fed with energy and release energy. So it's a release feeding process that gives rise to cycles. And I would encourage my friend here to consider homeokinesis as the goal of planning, which connects a great deal to the biological literature as well.
I'll have to Google that one.
Yep. Yeah, sure. So James Clooney. So this is really interesting. Thank you. On that question of, is the market curious? Is the market self-organizing? I don't know the answer either. I think it's a great question. But here's the thought. One of the big issues right now is climate change. And I'm interested in how the market's tackling that. Now, we know a lot of individual agents are quite interested in climate or ESG considerations. So too are some regulators who are involved in markets. But is the market as a whole self-organizing and trying to find a solution to this problem? In other words, is there a kind of collective market curiosity on how to solve this? Or is it just some individuals within it? And I don't know the answer, but I'd love to hear your initial thoughts.
Well, my initial thought is you've been trapped by the way you're asking the question. That it could well be both, and the logic I'm talking about is a both and logic, not an either or logic. Yeah. Yeah.
So just to follow on with this discussion that Aaron initiated and Karl was responding to, and the question in the back was about. It seems to me that you could have some of these abilities piecemeal, or maybe you disagree, that you could have, think of the owl that you draw attention to. So the owl you don't figure out what the owl's going to do just by looking at the environmental state. You have to take into account the owl's epistemic state, where it believes food might be, not just where food is, right? And I think that's an essential point. It seems to me we could have a market that has that kind of capability, a simple ability to represent possibilities for action without having all the other things that we've done with it or that animals have done with it, which is plan iteratively, be curious, actively seek the areas of its space that it would maximally provide the greatest amount of information. In other words, it might just happen to have the markets might stumble across one of these principles, which is just, if I have a representation of how things are, that might guide me instead of, in the absence of me not actually being able to directly access reality. And so it seems to me it becomes an easier pill to swallow, or an easier hypothesis to accept, if you don't package in all the great things that mentality gives you and then say, can the market have that? Maybe start simply and say, what about just what the owl is using there? Just having some basic representation of possibilities for action and expected outcomes one step ahead, and see whether that is motivated by data we see concerning markets. And if we can get that, then it would seem like that would be an encouraging sign to look further for the other kinds of mentality that you and Scott have been investigating.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, yeah. So I mean, practically the way that I would answer that question, and implicit in your answer, is I would actually build a generative model of the market. So there is beautiful data, even if it can't be used for prediction. There's a wealth of data out there. If you can explain those data by comparing an explanation where you've got one step ahead policies versus very deep policies with a deep time horizon, empirically you could answer that question. And I think imposing the question the way that you did speaks to, I think, an important notion of vagueness of mindfulness. I could sell linear quadratic control or a Kalman filter as a sort of very short depth, look ahead thing, simply because it works with gradients in time. So you have this notion now of mindful markets that could actually just be a Kalman filter. Or they could actually plan to, what would happen in a year's time if I did this or did that, and that would be a different kind of planning. The final sort of, perhaps it's less vague and more akin to a sort of the phase transition that Scott was talking about, but it's sort of self-awareness. At what point does does a mind suddenly find a hypothesis or a model? Oh, I am an entity. I am self. When does it acquire minimal selfhood? Which would be a prelude to it talking to you. So it may well be that you can imagine the market having some biophysical representation of probability distributions that could be interpreted as some kind of self-awareness. I don't know quite what it would look like, but in principle, there's no reason why it shouldn't.
Question in the towards the back. Oh, you've already got. Okay, sorry.
Yeah. Karl, thank you for your eloquent talk. I have a question that I've raised before. I'll bring it back. It's about your preference for Bayesian optimization modeling. 2 years ago, John Kay, who is sitting behind me, and Mervyn King published a book called Radical Uncertainty. In that book, they make the argument that in markets, modeling by means of expected utility maximization, rational expectations, and Bayesian updating are the problem, not the solution, because they assume a stable world. And that's exactly what it is not. So these models work most of the time, except when something happens. So that's the point. Now, you're not talking about markets. You're talking about the brain. But you love these Bayesian models. And so I'm, in my research, which is not about the brain, I'm not claiming I understand anything about behavior. For instance, how does an owl make a decision? What does it do to catch that animal? Yeah? Animal researchers have studied that. It's heuristics. It's an entire toolbox of heuristics. That is, and that's done in many decisions, like also decisions of majorities, like if 3 or 4 members of a foraging group march in the same direction, everyone else goes, and so on. Yeah? So that's very different than Bayesian theory. And my worry is that you run into the same problems with the brain as the traditional finance and economic theory is running. So Bayes needs a stable world where it's also that also has a small world, where you know all the future states. Otherwise you can't construct a probability distribution, neither objective nor subjective. So you're excluding that. And I would think the mind evolved to deal with an uncertain world, not with a stable world. Second, even within a stable world, if it's big enough, if the mind has many, many, many ideas, base becomes intractable at some point. You just can't do it. Third, even if you have only a few ideas, so base can be done, then one runs into an estimation problem. Because like with 10 variables you're thinking of to make a binary decision, you have 1,024 possibilities. You need to have the conditional probabilities for that. So I'm just going to admire your kind of modeling, but I worry that you're fundamentally on the wrong foot.
Thank you. Right.
You want to stand up?
Yeah.
Make sure you can stand up.
Is that clear? Okay. I'm not going to give you the same answer as last time, because just for the audience's entertainment, the last time was that I loved heuristics, and for me, heuristics were priors in deeply structured hierarchical models. I'm going to give you a different answer now, which I think covers all three concerns, and it's playing the Feynman card. So the kind of Bayes I'm talking about inherits from Richard Feynman's work in pathological formulations. So the densities he's talking about and I'm talking about are densities over trajectories, plans, narratives, paths. So this explicitly accommodates the knowing the future and the uncertainty about the future. So it does not require either a steady state or ergodicity or some kind of non-equilibrium steady state. So it's probability distributions over paths and dynamics, which is why I can connect to the dynamical formulation. The second, sorry, remind me what the second critique was. You're worried. We've done time. Oh, the tractability, yeah. The tractability, yeah. So the reason that Feynman introduced the sort of variational free energy was exactly to resolve the tractability problem. So he couldn't enumerate and do the marginalization of all the possible trajectories of a small particle. So the whole raison d'etre for this variational approximation is to make it tractable. And the argument is that evolution has found the same trick that Richard Feynman found in formulating approximate Bayesian inference as an optimization problem. So replacing the intractable marginalization integration problem with a tractable optimization. And that now licenses us to talk about normative accounts of behavior simply because you've got a well-defined objective function. And I can see time is passing quickly, so I'll leave the third one hanging. Yeah, the estimation problem is, I think, resolved by using the variational technology, which is interesting because it goes counter to Nick Chater's emphasis on sampling. So there's no sampling here. There never has been, never will be.
Maybe it does.
Very quick remark, just as a radical son of a Scotsman. One is that I think this whole picture of information, digital information, digital twins and all that stuff, I think this is the wrong view of information. I think that a much more Gibsonian ecological notion of information is required, that we ask exactly what information organisms use to find food. It's not about probability distributions and digital information processing. And the second thing, just as a challenge, if one pursued the metastable brain, then that is no longer in ones and zeros. It's not a digital entity at all. It's actually much more connected to the way the brain seems to work. Namely, there are oscillations in the brain, and there's frequency relations, there's phase relations that are part of the coordination of the brain. And if that's true, and if we want to, as it were, like von Neumann, mimic the brain here, then you would have to look at quantities like phases, which are transcendental numbers. So 0 to 2 pi, it's pi is transcendental. So it's not zeros and ones. It's it could be a far more richer framework than even so-called quantum computing.
Okay, so we had a question right here.
Hi, yeah, my name's Mashrita Chirmuta of Philosophy at Edinburgh. So I had a couple of questions that were prompted by Scott's talk. First, a simple terminological one. So there's this common distinction made between strong emergence versus weak emergence, also known as self-organization. So with strong emergence, there's the idea that the whole system has a top-down causal impact on the behavior of the parts, whereas with self-organization, you have some relatively simple and stable rules of behavior of the parts, which together collectively generate complex, unpredictable behavior. So I wanted to know which you were using when you were talking about emergence and self-organization in your talk.
Thank you for that. You have another question?
Yes.
Let's just handle that one very quickly. I think the strong weak maybe is not necessarily the distinction one would want to make. If there was time, I would show you that the emergence is actually due to the nonlinear coupling among the elements. So the coupling can't be just a coupling like a linear coupling. You will not get emergence. You'll just get something, an average, if you like. You have to have the nonlinear coupling to give rise to these phenomena. So that's the key aspect, regardless if it's weak or strong.
Okay. Yeah, so I think this is relevant in the context of market minds precisely because intuitively with markets we have this system where the behavior of the parts has a causal impact from the whole system. Like we perceive what the whole system is doing, and it seems like intuitively our behavior is affected by that. So the strong emergence idea seemed more applicable there. The second point was you relied quite heavily on this comparison between phase transitions in physics and how you would apply that to what's going on with brains. And this made me think of an argument recently put forward by neuroscientists Lily Krapp and Cording on the question, how do we understand neural networks? And they're actually saying that there's a strong difference between mesoscale physics, where you have very homogeneous systems, all the atoms are sort of identical, could be with one another anyway, very homogeneous collections of parts which undergo these phase transitions, and you can have very compact representations of them. So, differences between different kinds of materials, different elements can undergo collective behavior, which is very similar. You can describe in these universal models. Whereas with brains, each neuron has an individual characterization. So they have different histories anatomically. Each is very different. And they argue from that the expectation that you'll have very compact, simple models as you have in physics for describing collective phase transitions. They say they're pessimistic about being able to do that. And that leads them to this conclusion that the brain is just not understandable in the way that these physical phase transitions would be. So what do you think about that?
Well, I think there may be a little bit confusion with the way we normally think of phase transitions, that liquids can be solid and they can exhibit vapor. So this is the field of thermodynamics. And here one is talking about open systems that are open to exchanges of matter and information with the world. So they're open, and then the challenge is actually to find what the relevant quantities are. And this sits also with the constraints approach, say, of Haken in comparison to your approach. You need to know what the constraints are in order to compute your entropies and so on. Ed Janes, I'll throw out one little remark here that Karl showed, the maximum entropy principle, said, he's quite a brilliant man, little man, if any macroscopic phenomenon is reproducible, all microscopic details that were not measured are irrelevant.
Yeah, well, that's an optimistic note to finish on. But precisely the worry here was that it's the heterogeneity of the parts which makes things just behave very differently.
Well, that's actually central to the so-called extended HKB model.
Right.
And it's, I didn't get to this, but its scalability with Kuramoto and so on. The metastability scales up to n equals infinity, as well as n equals 8 interacting agents and so on, both experimentally and theoretically.
Okay, thank you.
So, would you mind just a couple of quick questions on, comments on that?
Go for it.
Yep. So, as a neuroscientist, there's lots of reproducibility and homogeneity, things like the canonical microcircuit. There are lots of things that are conserved. I think the kind of complexity you're talking about is what Professor Gigerenzer was talking about, which is deeply structured, factorized things that underwrite things like priors and heuristics and ways of doing things, what and where streams, functional specialization, functional segregation. This should not be confused with random fluctuations that can be discounted in the slaving principle and mathematical treatments of self-organization. So complexity is not random fluctuations.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So we have 1 minute left, and I think I'll defer that 1 minute to the very patient gentleman, which is one seat behind you and across the aisle. Right. Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your inspirational talks. I want to go quickly back to this idea about mindedness. So in philosophy, people who study group minds, there is this idea that, to argue that something has a mind, it must exhibit at least one mental property, whatever that might be. And Professor Friston mentioned homeostasis. Sorry?
Microphone. Hold it to your mouth. Yeah, keep your
Okay. Professor Kelso mentioned homeokinetics. So the thing is, with these kind of properties, if this is what we're looking for when we're looking for a mind, you might allow for things like the Gaia hypothesis. The market mind hypothesis is pretty similar. So I just want to pick your brains and see, would you be happy with this, or would you like something more, like maybe decision making as evidence that something has a mind?
Do you want to say?
After you?
After me. Well, that's good. You have the last word, Karl. Thank you. Yeah. I think, in science, the analogies one makes are crucial. Maxwell, James Clerk Maxwell, wrote a little treatise on what he called dynamic analogy, crucial to the emergence of our understanding of nature. So I think it's a very interesting hypothesis that you make, Gaia and the market. And these other questions about emergence and strong emergence and so on. You see, the components here are also self-organized all the way down. So you have to get to the levels issue, you have to look one level down and see if you can derive it from that level, and then keep going. And it's that kind of strategy, it's kind of it's almost ontological in terms of its approach, that says I can only talk about the influence of an upper level on a lower level if I know what those lower level components are, and I know how they nonlinear interact to produce the upper level. Then the upper level can condition the elements. So you can tell the story quite rigorously that way, and it's up to you, my friend, to make the analogy stick. How closely can you make that analogy stick? Because that's what scientific progress, in my view, is largely about.
So very briefly, just to reinforce that and speak to the question. So I'm thinking, what's it called?
Well, homeokinesis. Homeokinetics. He's called it the science of homeokinetics.
Right. I don't know about that, but I do know about allostasis, which is basically the next stage on from homeostasis, where you make preemptive moves to make your homeostasis work. And I use that notion because that was at the heart of Ross Ashby's work on his homeostat. So the origins of self-organization in cybernetics were predicated exactly on this allostatic, the word I have to Google. And it may well, and just listening to Scott's answer, the heart of this is a separation of temporal scales. So I think speaks to the nature of top-down versus bottom-up causation, strong versus weak emergence. I think the answer is a separation of temporal scales. So if it is the case that there is a separation of temporal scales in markets, then you could have a kind of allostasis and kind of mindfulness of that kind. So for example, if there are regulatory structures that change more slowly than the actual markets themselves, and you can get a clear separation of temporal scales, then you could get the sort of conditionalization or contextualization of fast dynamics being contextualized by slow, responsive regulatory dynamics where there is a circular causality. So that might be, one way of writing down the dynamics of a more mindful market, which is truly extended not just in space but also in time. But it does again rest upon the separation of temporal timescales to get that out.
There is an issue there, quite a deep issue, and that is, does the separation of timescales exist in these markets? See, actually, mind and the market may be on rather similar timescales. You see, and if that's the case, then one has to develop new tools, new ideas, new thoughts to show that. Because you don't have the clear separation of the, slave away the fast modes, because they relax so quickly you can basically ignore them and then just lead with the principal mode, as it were, or the principal modes that carry the information, you see. If it's like that, then we need to, that needs to be shown in the market hypothesis, the market mind hypothesis, you see. So that's...
We are out of time. We are over time. But thanks. This is exactly what I had feared, which is a great outcome.